Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Kodiak Island Assembly Work Session. We are located in the Assembly Chambers on today, Thursday, February 23rd, 2023. It is 6:30 p.m. Tonight we have a work session immediately followed by a special session. We'll open tonight with citizens' comments. If you'd like to call in, the phone number is 907-486-3231, or you can use our toll-free number, 1-855-492-9202. Please remember, if you're in the audience and you'd like to make a public comment, to step up to the podium. Please state your name for the record and be sure to turn on the microphone. If you're calling in, please remember to turn off your listening device and direct all comments to the body as a whole and not any individual member thereof. Not having any comments in the audience or phone calls in, we'll move on to our agenda items. The first agenda item for tonight is the review of the procurement approval letter adjustments for the borough manager. Mr. Conrad.
Yes, good evening and thank you. I did not prepare a lot for this. I thought this was a good opportunity to begin a conversation. Looking back through history, in about 2013, the manager's authority was at $15,000. It was then raised to $25,000 in about 18, and what we're requesting consideration is for $50,000. And the reason we're requesting this is simply keeping up with inflation. We had that procurement for the hospital for the auxiliary heating unit #1 motor, which was a $28,000 motor. We bought it on an emergency purchase, but I don't like to use the term emergency unless it's an emergency. In that particular case, it was. However, I believe this is somewhat of a trust issue, and I also believe that irregardless of what the cost is, I mean, if it's a couple $100, it's one thing, but if it's a significant amount of money, at the very next meeting of the assembly, I believe it's the manager's duty or the financial officer's duty to report to the assembly what's been expended. This is no means trying to, get around anything. It's going to be up front, at least as long as I'm involved. I hope it to be up front. And I think that it should be based on economy and not based on personality. But reality is you can't buy a whole lot of machine parts and whatnot for $25,000 anymore, and sometimes we just can't wait 2 weeks or more to be able to get it before the assembly and do it per their purchasing requirements. That's all I have.
Thank you. Are there any assembly comments? Mr. Smiley?
Yeah, we raised the amount for the manager to give preference to local hires within local businesses within 10% a year ago or so, raise that from 25 to 50. I don't see any problem with this. I agree that it's a case of inflation for the most part. There are other places in the code that specify $25,000, and they should probably be fixed as well, because money just isn't worth what it used to be. I have no concerns about the fidelity of the manager in determining these kinds of things, and certainly as an assembly we have purview after the fact.
Mr. Conrad?
And I would offer up that I will say that perhaps what we should do is, again, have this as the start of the conversation, but look at that entire procurement section and maybe come before the assembly with a potential change to the code. That might be the best way to proceed.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm coughing. Larry.
Thank you. I'm very supportive of the change. However, one of the things, once we grant that, it's absolute. That means it gives the manager complete contracting authority, and after the fact, the assembly can't go back and do that once we grant it. I mean, we could cancel it, but it's absolute, and it could cover everything from a personnel complaint that you decide to pay somebody $40,000 or something. It could cover anything, and I think that, well, I support it, especially for contracting and I don't have any problem with that. I think what you're suggesting for further conversation is necessary to see where the limits of that would be in terms of, because in the past, and I'm going all the way back to the 60s, if you will, when my grandfather was involved, there have been managers that didn't operate necessarily with the fidelity that we would want. And once they made that decision, it's final. I mean, if you decide to grant a certain amount of money to someone and you sign off on it, then the assembly has signed off on it. We can't come back and say, we don't agree with that. So I just think that I support it completely, but I think we have further discussion in terms of what the parameters of where that would apply and not apply.
Thank you, Larry. Jeff?
Yeah, I apologize for probably repeating what's already been said, but I certainly support it. But I also, after spending some time with Carl Hertz in the hospital and understanding the expenses that they're faced with, and in the need to be able to move quickly when an emergency does arise to secure equipment or to order equipment, to have to wait to go through a work session, to then have to wait until we go to a regular meeting, certainly adds delays that are unnecessary in that situation. So I definitely support looking at this, but I like the idea of looking at it in its entirety. And I'm not opposed to looking at even a higher limit when it comes to some of those facilities such as the hospital, so that they can get somebody to respond in a timely manner, and they can take care of what they need to be able to continue to provide for the health care of this community.
Thanks, Jeff. I think that code change that we made earlier found a loophole in the code where the local preference amount was still at $15,000, and we raised that to match the rest of the code up to $25,000. So I don't think there's anywhere in the code right now that's $50,000. So we'll have to do a kind of a full review of that and find all of those places so we don't leave any of those loopholes in the future. Are there any other comments from the Assembly? All right, thanks, Dave. Next item on the agenda tonight is discussion of the Kodiak Fisheries Research Center staffing.
Basically, we've operated now for 6 months on a Thursday and Friday. We have had from June through December, there was approximately 3,060 people through the facility. The Ocean Sciences program is being conducted by the part-time employee of NOAA over there, the contract employee. So that has not affected the schools. The cost was approximately $8,000 was the payroll for 6 months temporary. We have laid that temporary position off so that we can have this conversation, because 6 months and 1 day, that person will start accruing leave and be eligible for other benefits. So basically, the question remains is how much do we want to fund this? Do we want to fund it at 2 days a week? We have cruise ship season coming up. The cruise ships are a bit of an odd animal because, number one, they don't show up just Thursdays and Fridays, but there are times when you have a very large cruise ship show up and you might get 6 or 8 people. There is no one transporting folks from the cruise ship area to KFRC, and these folks, some of these folks are walking. And I personally felt pretty horrible a couple of times going, sorry, we're closed, but that's what's happening. So somehow we need to figure out the best path forward here. I had someone say to me, and I never thought of it this way, that, a lot of these folks are coming from places that have like SeaWorld and large aquariums. And although this is a great facility and it's a wonderful aquarium and touch tank, I don't know that it is of the size and nature that it's an attraction for cruise ship customers. So is that a customer base that we need to even consider in this conversation? Or should we really be focused on local residents, the school district participation, and visitors of local residents? And I think that's what we really need to define, is where does this fit into the tourism or the education for Kodiak.
Thank you. Are there any Assembly member comments? Larry?
I certainly think it's important to school children, like you've mentioned, and I agree with that. I personally feel uncomfortable adding another position during budget times, I mean, to cover it during the summer. I said, when you go into a lot of communities, they have volunteers, seniors, different people who actually really enjoy that kind of thing. Not just seniors, but everybody, but they're volunteers. And they're there specifically to provide insight and information to people that visit. And it seems like that's what we used to do in the past, and it doesn't seem like we have the money to support new positions or positions that become very expensive. So that would be my first thought.
Thank you, Larry. Joe?
I thinking, I have similar feelings. I think feels to me like we should be concentrating more on the local people, and whenever there's a cruise ship that happens to be around, if they come in, then that's great. But we are experiencing a bit of a budget crunch, and I think if it's only going to be a couple of months, we would need to be planned for longer than that, really. But I think that we could do just as much good doing it the way we are, with concentrating on our local place, and whoever filters in comes in.
Thank you, Joe. Scott?
Well, several things. I think that if you offered this as a summer position to a graduate student, and there are all kinds of ways of identifying them, I think that would be really a good idea. They generally have a lot of verve in their lives at that point. Secondly, I'm not sure, but I would think that we could negotiate with CATS to move people from the cruise ships to KFRC if we did it right. I don't know the answer to that, but it's at least a thought. I think it's important for the community, not only for locals, but specifically for elementary school children. I mean, we live in a community that's surrounded by the ocean, and many of our people make a living off the ocean, and having a direct connection educationally with the critters in the ocean is a really good thing, I think. And I know my wife was involved in it for a while, and she derived a great deal of satisfaction from taking kids to the facility. So I think there's all kinds of opportunities with elementary school teachers there as well. But I would look to finding a graduate student or someone else who has experience in that area for the summer. It's a nice chunk of change to cover things. So.
Thank you, Scott. Any other Assembly comments? I will just add that the cruise ship schedule, as Dave has mentioned, does not just happen on Thursday and Fridays. We have ships coming in 7 days a week, and I think the one thing that we could do is discuss with Jerry Clark over at First Student and see if any of the cruise ships are interested in chartering their tours and making that a stop. I know that they're going to be looking for additional things to do because of the Lutig Museum closures over the summer, so they will be needing to have somewhere to take people. So that might be something that we can work with him, and then we would be able to have scheduled hours. We'd know when they would be there, so that's an option, and then we can utilize that same bus system that they're already using for their cruise ships. Dave?
I appreciate Mr. Ledoux's comment about volunteers. The only comment I would also make is that we'll probably need to employ a volunteer coordinator, because when that volunteer calls in sick or doesn't show up, you have to cover that shift. So that's my experience in the past for doing things like this, but that's another thought just to throw out there.
Thank you. Any other Assembly comments? All right, the next thing on the agenda tonight is the discussion of the budget calendar and policy decisions. You'll see that in your papers in front of you, you've been given a calendar that outlines the upcoming dates as they have to do with the budget. Dave, is there anything you want to add to my calendar comments?
Dora and I sat down yesterday with Mayor Williams and Assemblymember Smiley and discussed this, and we have received a certain amount of direction. And at this point in time, we'll be pursuing that particular direction. I heard a conversation prior to the meeting start. All of the department budgets are in. Per conversations yesterday, I will ask all directors and the clerk to please look at the costs associated with what they've budgeted for training, because I think training is important. And I think service areas are doing well. I will talk to Dora tomorrow, because I believe that there is a service area that has one member currently, and I'm not quite sure how they're going to hold a budget hearing. So I think we may have a couple of anomalies, but we're also not talking about millions of dollars with those associated with those service areas. However, they need to be considered because snow needs to be plowed and roads need to be graded. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. Are there any questions about the calendar as presented tonight? Jeff?
Yeah, I'm not privy to the conversations that have already occurred. I certainly would like to see us try to move this June 10th second reading up to June 1st, and that's only because I'm on a plane June 2nd for the Bay, and I'd certainly like to be involved in it. But I don't know. I think June 1st is. I don't know if it's a regular meeting, so maybe it's already earmarked to be, because you've got June 10th on the calendar here.
I just think it has to be done by June 10th. So I think we're most likely going to read it on the 1st, and then the 8th would be panic backup date if it is not done by then. So it's in by the 10th, but the second reading should occur well before the 10th.
Okay.
By code, June 10th, if the assembly has not adopted a budget, the manager's budget becomes the budget for that fiscal year.
Right, just looking, if I could, at the calendar on the wall here, you've got a regular meeting on the 1st, and we've got a work session on the 8th, so we're not going to take official action on the work session of the 8th unless a special meeting was called.
Yes, we will schedule that on the 1st if needed, and as many as it takes before that, but I don't think that should be a problem.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeff. Larry?
My concerns, and I wouldn't call them concerns, are more philosophical perhaps. I see one of my primary responsibilities as an assembly member is to represent the needs of the community and some of the priorities that, the borough takes care of under statute. And it seems like by the time we see the budget, it's already sort of formed. Priorities have been set. And let's say that somebody wanted to spend more money on Parks and Rec. Then it would be very difficult to do so, because the budget is already, even though it can be adjusted by the assembly, it's still sitting there. And what you want to prioritize means you're taking from somewhere else, or you're increasing the size of the budget. So by the time the assembly really gets to see the manager's budget, it's starting to coalesce like Jell-O, if you will. And it's difficult for assembly members to reprioritize some of the directions, including, discussions on what the revenue is probably going to be, how much room there is to play around with it. And in the absence of a really good strategic plan, and a strategic plan means we talk about it all the time. We don't just have one on a shelf somewhere, but we actually look at it and say, are we actually doing these things? And the concern that I have is that we need to give you, as the manager, good information on what these priorities are. So once you present the budget, it doesn't get all, twisted and torqued out of shape. And it's just been my observation from going through, 30 years of budgets, that without that information early, all you can do is sort of reconstruct what we're already done the previous year. And that doesn't make any sense to me. It seems like the assembly should say, here are some priorities that we want to look at, that we want you to consider as you build the budget, So when it finally comes to us, some of those are integrated into the budget. Because once it takes shape, it's difficult to change. And then people argue about this, and everything is, so if Scott wants to, Assemblymember Smiley wants to do this priority, and Assemblymember Turner wants to do this, then they're going like this. They're competing with one another. Whereas if we did this early, those things could be incorporated in the budget. And then when you present it, you don't have to sit there and go through, a month of what I've seen in the past. Not with you, by the way, at all, but in the past. And I'm a little concerned with that, because I think that we represent the public, and if some of the needs that we represent are difficult to change the direction or of the budget, then we're not doing our jobs fully. And this isn't a complaint on what you present. It's the process that I don't see it happening, because the first time we see the budget, it's already in place, if that makes any sense.
Thank you, Larry. Dave, did you have anything you wanted to add?
So this was an anomaly year in that we lost Dora for several weeks due to health issues. And that's sort of why we wanted to put this calendar before you, is right now we're at our level 1 budget. That's all the further we've gone. This gives you the opportunity to do exactly what you're saying, but it would trigger special meetings or whatnot, or discussions by the assembly to be able to provide that strategic plan that doesn't happen on a regular basis in the past.
And I appreciate that. The kind of discussions that I'm talking about would have happened in October and November at the early stages, so we could have had, really good discussions, and we could have sort of, given you the information to present it, so when it comes, there's no surprise. We sort of have worked and baked that pie together. And so I'm not suggesting we do it now. I'm just saying that as we move forward, it might be good for us to sit down and really take a look at that process and how we can be more involved in the development. That's all. Thank you.
James?
So I tend to agree with Larry on this particular case, because we used to dive into the budget on Saturdays, not too many years ago, and we would meet in here, have a special meeting, and just go over the budget. Sometimes we would have department heads in here to discuss particular items, but that was kind of a line item by a line item, and we've kind of gotten away from that. But I think if we somewhat change that agenda, instead of doing a line item by line item, we just had a plain discussion about the whole picture for a couple of weekends before we get into, April or the end of April, then I think that we could all have a clearer picture of what we want before we get into that school district request. So I think I asked for this last year to have more meetings about this. That kind of got shot down and we didn't have very many, but I'm going to ask again. I think that we should have a couple more meetings about this instead of just waiting until we have work sessions.
Thank you, James. If the assembly requests to have more meetings, I'm assuming that would take place in the month of April, correct? Since the manager's budget is due to us at the end of March. So we'll have agenda setting again the week of the 16th. That would be the first time we could get the clerk, the manager, and Mr. Smiley here together, and we could look at adding those in. Thank you. Are there any other comments tonight? That moves us to clerk's comments. Are there any clerk's comments tonight?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I would like to remind everyone that the APOC financial disclosure forms are due by March 15. So for those of you who have not filed yet, please don't forget That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Nova, and thanks for joining us from vacation tonight. That takes us to,
problem.
that brings us to manager's comments. Mr. Conrad?
Yes, good evening. First thing I'd like to announce actually is we're having our second Health Facilities Committee meeting is on March the 2nd at 3 p.m. It'll be located here in this room. And I have invited Mr. Hertz from the hospital as well as the maintenance staff to talk about preventative maintenance items that are going on. And then the large ask for basically rebuilding the HVAC systems at the hospital, including adding air handler units, chillers, fixing the steam generators. So it's quite extensive ask, and this is precisely why I asked to form this committee, so that we can get these larger, potentially multi-year projects before the assembly in a more timely manner. We are looking, later we'll be discussing Hunter Access Grant, and I won't get into that right now. As stated, we have awarded contracts, well, you're aware that for 4 vehicles, and Tuesday we have bid for 2 light trucks is due. As of this date, we have received no submissions on that, so we'll be making a few phone calls tomorrow. One of the biggest things, one thing I will say is that community development and the engineering staff is going to be assisting the finance department by beginning to place delinquent tax notices on mobile homes and at certain businesses. And I think the public needs to be aware that this is something that we do every year. And this is not picking on anybody. This is done by the tax rolls, and it's just part of doing business. And that begins tomorrow, but I think the public needs to be made aware of that. The property assessment and taxation software bid opening is February 28th, and we have actually received a bid for that, which we're kind of excited about. So hopefully we can get some updated software. The other item is that the property value information will be sent to the printers tomorrow. It'll be mailed. The notice of valuation copies will be mailed out by February 28th, and protest period begins March 1st and ends March 30th. And I believe the residents and taxpayers need to be made aware that those deadlines are coming up here. If you don't agree with your valuation, then please call and make an appointment if possible, so you can come in and have a conversation with a representative of the assessing office. That's all I have for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Are there any questions on the manager's report tonight? Jeff?
Yeah, thank you. I just have a couple of questions, Dave. One on the Health Facilities Advisory Board next Thursday. I know Assemblymember Arndt, who wasn't present at our first meeting, is going to be gone again next Thursday. And I just wonder, before we get too far down the road, with him not being present, if it might be a consideration to move that to a later date. Or maybe it's not pertinent.
To be honest, I think we can catch him up.
Okay.
I can make arrangements to have him actually go over to the facility and go through some of the stuff, put his eyes on it, or all of you for that matter. So I think we can catch him up.
Okay. And then the second question I have, and if I could, is over on Near Island at the UAF building, and I know we talked about this a week ago or so in terms of how that's being used or it was offered for use, but there is some beautiful artwork of etched glass right outside that building that sits in overgrowth right now. And I'm assuming that was probably part of the 1% of the arts when that construction took place. But I don't know how much the public actually goes to that building anymore. It seems to sit vacant a large part of the year. And I'm wondering if there's a process for taking the artwork that's sitting basically in the trees and moving it to an area where more members of the community could enjoy it. I mean, it's beautiful etched salmon in glass, about 6 panels worth. And so I was thinking about that this morning, so I figured I'd bring it up tonight.
Thank you, Jeff. Scott?
Yeah, it's not abandoned in any way, shape, or form. It's UAF's building. They own the glassware as well. So I don't think that that's going to be easy to do. The building has been fairly active. It has a industrial level laboratory in it that's been used pretty extensively for developing new products from seaweeds, both brown and red algae, as far as I know. And there's a fairly large contingent of marine MAP, Marine Advisory Program, people in the building active at the time.
Thank you, Scott. Jeff, any other questions?
Well, no, thank you for that, because when I go there, the parking lot sits empty a lot of the days of the week. So I just made an assumption that that building was not being fully utilized. So thank you for the clarity.
Not seeing any other questions, we'll move on to Assembly member comments. We'll start with Mr. Turner tonight.
No comments, thank you.
Mr. Delgado?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd just like to say, this Saturday, we are starting a Native Youth Council, and this Saturday is going to be their first meeting. So that's exciting. It's in conjunction with my work, so we're going to try to train some of our next leaders, and we are still hoping that more youth from the villages will apply, but this is going to be exciting this weekend. That's all I have tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Smith?
Just a thank you to DOT for their continued maintenance on the road to Antone this winter, and the amount of time they're spending grading that road is quite impressive this year, so I certainly appreciate their efforts.
Thank you. Mr. Ledoux?
I don't have any comments tonight.
Thank you. Mr. Smiley?
Yeah, I'm glad that the snow is gone off my property. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smiley. I don't have any mayor's comments for right now, so that will end the Assembly work session. And we will be taking a 5-minute break, and we will start the special meeting in about 5 minutes. Thank you.